The year was 1884, and the silence in Elias Vance's cabin was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence that had long ago settled into the rough-hewn timbers of the walls and the cold ashes of the hearth. It was the silence of a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice for days at a time, a silence born not of peace, but of a profound and hollowed-out loss. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled like a thing grieving, scouring the last of the autumn light from the sky and piling snow into deep, unforgiving drifts against the lone structure. The land itself was an extension of his solitude, vast and empty and indifferent. Elias sat at his small table, the meager light from a tallow lamp casting his shadow long and distorted against the wall. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of ranch work, were wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. He was a man made of hard lines and sharp angles, his face a landscape carved by weather and sorrow. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, held a permanent distance. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, built it for a life that had been snatched away by fever 3 winters past. He had built it for the laughter of a wife and the patter of a small child's feet, but now it held only the echoes of their absence. His daily routine was a bulwark against memory. Rise before dawn, tend the few hardy cattle that survived in his sheltered valley, check his trap lines, chop wood, and then return to the crushing quiet of the cabin as dusk bled across the snow. It was a life of pure function, a way to mark the passage of time without truly living it. He had come to this isolated patch of land to escape the world of men with its pitying glances and clumsy words of comfort. Here, the mountains did not judge, and the snow fell on the graves of his wife, Hannah, and their son, little Caleb, with the same impartiality it fell upon his roof. He had wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his ghosts, to let the seasons wear him down until he was as much a part of the landscape as the wind-stunted pines that clung to the ridges. He was a man whittled down to the bone, a sentinel guarding a tomb of memories, and he believed this was all that remained for him. It was the frantic barking of his dog, Blue, that first broke the spell of the night. The sound was sharp, insistent, not the usual warning of a coyote or a bear, but something more urgent. Elias rose, his movements economical and cautious, and took the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs by the door. He quieted Blue with a low murmur and a hand on his ruff, his own ears straining against the gale. Through the relentless shriek of the wind, he heard it a splintered, desperate sound that could have been human voices, or perhaps just the storm playing tricks on a lonely man's mind. He moved to the single window, wiping a patch of frost from the glass. For a moment, he saw nothing but the churning chaos of the blizzard, a white wall of impenetrable fury. Then, a shape materialized from the swirling snow, a specter staggering towards the faint yellow light of his cabin. It was followed by another and another, until a small, huddled group of figures became visible, lurching through the deep drifts like wraiths. They were impossibly close. He could make out the pallor of their clothes against the snow, a ghostly white that made no sense in this wilderness. A loud, desperate banging on his door rattled the very timbers of the cabin. Blue erupted into a fresh frenzy of barking. Elias's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. No sane person would be out in a storm like this, miles from any town or established trail. They were either fools or something far worse. He braced himself, his jaw set, and pulled the heavy bolt. The door flew open, blasted by a gust of wind and snow that sent flakes swirling into the room, extinguishing the lamp and plunging them into near darkness, save for the faint glow from the banked embers in the hearth. 5 women stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of frozen limbs and tattered white fabric. They were dressed in wedding gowns, or what was left of them, the fine lace and silk torn, stained with mud and stiff with ice. Their faces were blue with cold, their hair matted with snow, their eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the room. They looked like fallen angels, cast out of some distant heaven into the heart of his desolate hell. One of them, a woman with fire in her eyes, despite the cold that threatened to consume her, pushed herself to her knees. Her gaze met his, direct and pleading. "Please, mister," she gasped, her voice a raw whisper. "You have to help us, we're being hunted." Behind her, another girl, barely more than a child, began to sob, the sound thin and broken. Elias stood frozen, the rifle still in his hands, the cold wind a physical blow against his back. The silence he had so carefully cultivated for 3 years had not just been broken, it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. 5 runaway brides had brought the world, with all its violence and desperation, crashing through his door. And as he looked at their faces, he understood that their shocking plea was not just for shelter from the storm. It was a plea for sanctuary from men, and he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that saying yes would invite the very trouble he had come here to escape. Elias shut the door against the storm, the heavy wood groaning as it sealed them in. He slid the bolt back into place, the sound echoing with a grim finality in the small, crowded space. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the faint orange glow of the embers, the cold metal of the Winchester, a familiar weight in his hands. The women remained on the floor, a tableau of exhaustion and fear, watching his every move. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, cold earth, and a sharp, metallic tang of fear. "Get up," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Get near the fire before you freeze solid." His words, devoid of warmth but practical, seemed to break their paralysis. The woman who had spoken first, her jaw set with a stubborn resilience, helped the younger, sobbing girl to her feet. Another, a sturdier woman with a pragmatic, weary face, began methodically brushing snow from her companion's shoulders. Slowly, the 5 of them huddled together near the hearth, their hands outstretched towards the dying embers, their shivering so violent it was audible. One of them, pale and feverish, listed against her neighbor, her breathing shallow and ragged. Elias moved with a deliberate slowness, not wanting to spook them further. He laid the rifle on the table and knelt at the hearth, adding small, dry pieces of kindling, coaxing the embers back to life. Flames licked upwards, catching the wood, and a growing circle of light pushed back the shadows, illuminating the women's faces more clearly. They were all young, their expressions a mixture of desperation and defiance. The state of their wedding dresses told a story of a frantic, brutal escape through unforgiving terrain. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the iron hook over the fire. He said nothing, and neither did they. It was a silence of assessment, thick with unspoken questions. He could feel their eyes on him, gauging his intent, searching for signs of threat or salvation. He was acutely aware of the intrusion, the sudden and overwhelming presence of life and trouble in a space he had reserved for ghosts. The woman who seemed to be their leader finally broke the quiet. "My name is Clara Shaw," she said, her voice gaining a little strength in the growing warmth. "Thank you for letting us in." She gestured to the others. "This is Martha, Beatrice, and Esther. The one who is ill is Abigail." Elias gave a curt nod, his gaze lingering for a moment on Abigail's flushed cheeks and labored breathing. "Who's hunting you?" he asked, his tone flat. He wanted the facts, unadorned. Pity was a luxury he could not afford. Clara's expression hardened. "A man named Garrett Blackwood, from the mining camp over at Crimson Gulch." Elias knew the name. Blackwood was a man who had built a small, rotten empire on the desperation of others. He ran the saloon, the supply store, and, it was rumored, anything else that turned a grubby profit. He was known for his ruthlessness and the brutal men he kept on his payroll. Crimson Gulch was a hard place, and Garrett Blackwood was its hardest edge. "What does he want with you?" Elias asked, though he was beginning to piece together the grim picture. It was Martha, the practical one, who answered, her voice laced with a bitter cynicism. "He wants his property back. That's what we were, mail-order brides, bought and paid for. Only he wasn't looking for wives for the miners. He was looking for girls for his saloon." The word property hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Esther, the youngest, flinched at the bluntness of the words, pulling her tattered veil tighter around her shoulders like a shroud. Beatrice, a quiet woman with watchful eyes, simply stared into the flames, her face unreadable. So this was their shocking plea. It was not just for a roof and a fire. They were fugitives, escaped chattel. To harbor them was to declare war on a man like Blackwood. It meant inviting violence, a siege, a fight that a solitary man on an isolated ranch had no hope of winning. Everything in him screamed to turn them back out into the storm. It was not his fight. He had sought this solitude precisely to avoid such entanglements. But then he looked at them again. He saw the raw fear in Esther's eyes, so like the look in a cornered doe. He saw the fierce, protective anger in Clara's face as she wrapped an arm around the trembling girl. He saw the sheer, bone-deep weariness of Martha and the quiet endurance of Beatrice. And he saw Abigail, shivering uncontrollably now, her life hanging by a thread. He saw not property, but people, frightened, determined, horribly vulnerable people. He thought of Hannah, of her strength and her kindness. What would she have done? The question was a sharp pain behind his ribs. He knew the answer. He had run from the world of the living, but it had found him anyway, delivered to his doorstep in the form of 5 broken brides. He stood up and walked to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it, the hinges groaning in protest, and pulled out several thick wool blankets. They smelled of cedar and disuse. He carried them over to the women. "The water will be hot soon," he said, his voice still gruff, betraying none of the conflict raging within him. He handed the blankets to Clara. "Get her," he gestured toward Abigail, "wrapped up. The rest of you, too. You can sleep by the fire." Clara took the blankets, her eyes searching his for a long moment. She found no softness, no reassurance, only a grim resolve, but for now, it was enough. "We have some money," she offered, her voice low. "We can pay for our keep." Elias shook his head. "Keep your money. You'll need it." He turned away, busying himself with making coffee, his back to them. "The storm will cover your tracks for a day or two. After that, Blackwood will come." He did not say, "I will protect you." He did not say, "You are safe here." He offered no promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He stated only the facts. But in choosing not to send them away, in giving them blankets and the warmth of his fire, he had made a choice. He had opened his door to 5 strangers and, in doing so, had closed it on the solitude he had thought would be his tomb. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of ragged breathing and the simmering of a kettle, and Elias Vance knew his war had just begun. The first few days were a tense dance of proximity and distance. The cabin, which had always felt empty and vast in its silence, was now impossibly small, crowded with the rustle of movement and the low murmur of female voices. Elias felt like a bear whose cave had been invaded, his every routine disrupted, his solitude shattered. He moved through the space with a guarded stiffness, acutely aware of the 5 pairs of eyes that followed him. They watched him chop wood, mend a harness, clean his rifle. He, in turn, watched them. He observed how Clara quickly and naturally assumed leadership, organizing their meager existence. She rationed the food he provided, without him having to ask, her movements efficient and her gaze missing nothing. He saw Martha's skepticism in the way she tested the floorboards before putting her weight on them, the way she assessed the cabin's construction, her eyes lingering on the bolt of the door and the shutters of the windows. She was a survivor, and she trusted nothing and no one, least of all their reluctant host. Esther remained a frightened shadow, rarely speaking, her hands constantly twisting a piece of her ruined dress. But Elias noticed that she was the first to offer a blanket to Abigail or to help Beatrice, whose quiet competence was beginning to emerge. Beatrice, he discovered, had a gentle, knowing touch. She took over the care of Abigail, who was in the grip of a powerful lung fever. Using a poultice of mustard and flour that Elias reluctantly provided, and brewing a tea from willow bark she recognized growing near the creek, she tended to the sick woman with a focused calm. Elias found himself watching Beatrice's hands, surprisingly steady and sure, as she bathed Abigail's forehead or coaxed a spoonful of broth between her lips. There was a quiet strength in her that belied her unassuming presence. Communication was sparse and strictly functional. More wood is needed. The water bucket is empty. Is there any more flour? They were questions, not conversation. Elias would answer with a nod or a single word, retrieve what was needed, and retreat back into his own space, a small corner of the cabin he had mentally cordoned off for himself. He ate his meals standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, while they ate huddled by the fire. It was an uneasy truce, a cohabitation born of necessity, not choice. He learned snippets of their story, not from direct telling, but from overheard whispers when they thought he was asleep or outside. He pieced together the lies they had been fed through letters, promises of respectable husbands, homes, and new lives in the West. He learned of their long, arduous journey, only to arrive at Crimson Gulch and be herded into a locked room in Blackwood's saloon. He heard the fear in their voices as they spoke of Blackwood's cold, possessive eyes and the leering faces of the men he'd intended to sell them to. Their escape had been a desperate gamble on the night of the storm, a flight into a blizzard that was less terrifying than the fate that awaited them. One afternoon, 4 days after their arrival, the storm had broken, leaving the world encased in a brilliant, blinding white. Elias was outside, clearing a path to the lean-to that served as his barn, the crisp air burning his lungs. Clara came out, pulling a blanket tightly around her shoulders. The cold made her cheeks flush, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of something other than fear or grim determination in her face. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her gaze sweeping over the vast, untouched expanse of snow, the sharp peaks of the mountains piercing a sky of impossible blue. Elias grunted in response, not stopping his work. "It'll kill you just as quick." She ignored his gruffness. "We can't stay here forever, Mr. Vance. We can't put you in this danger." "He knows you're gone by now," Elias said, leaning the shovel against the wall. "His men will be searching as soon as the passes are clear. You won't make it 10 miles on foot." "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice laced with frustration. "We can't just wait here for him to find us." "For now, you wait," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Abigail's too sick to move, and you're all still weak." He looked at her then, his gaze direct. "You know how to use one of these?" He nodded toward the rifle leaning against the cabin door. Clara's eyes widened slightly. "My father taught me to shoot. For hunting rabbits, not men." "Not much difference in the aiming," Elias said flatly. "Martha looks like she knows her way around a tool. Get her to help you with the shutters. Reinforce them from the inside. Beatrice, you keep doing what you're doing with Abigail, and the young one, Esther, find her something to do. Keep her hands busy. Idle hands lead to fear." It was the most he had said to any of them at one time. It was not an offer of comfort, it was a strategy for survival, but it was also a shift. He was no longer just a provider of shelter. He was including them, acknowledging their presence not as burdens, but as potential participants in their own defense. He was giving them tasks, a purpose beyond just cowering by the fire. Clara watched him walk away toward the cattle, a tall, solitary figure against the vast white canvas. She saw the profound loneliness in the set of his shoulders, the deep-seated pain he tried so hard to conceal. She was beginning to understand that they had not just stumbled into a cabin, but into the heart of a man's carefully constructed exile. And she realized, with a dawning clarity, that in forcing him to face their trouble, they had also forced him to face the world again. The barriers were still there, high and cold as the surrounding peaks, but for the first time she saw a crack, a small fissure through which a fragile, tentative connection might begin to grow. The days that followed settled into a new, strange rhythm. The cabin became a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. Under Clara's direction, the women worked to earn their keep and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Martha, proving Elias's assessment correct, showed a surprising aptitude for carpentry. Using his tools, she and Clara reinforced the shutters until they were sturdy enough to withstand a heavy blow. Beatrice continued her tireless care of Abigail, whose fever finally broke one evening, leaving her weak but lucid for the first time. The collective sigh of relief in the cabin was a tangible thing, a moment of shared victory that briefly warmed the chilly air between them. Elias found a role for Esther. He brought in a stack of his old, worn-out shirts and a leather working kit. "We'll need patches for saddlebags, maybe extra bindings," he said, his voice gruff as he showed her how to use the awl and thread. The simple, repetitive task seemed to soothe her frayed nerves. Her small hands, initially clumsy, grew more adept with each stitch. It was the first time he had initiated an interaction that was not about a direct, immediate need, and the small act of guidance did not go unnoticed. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small offerings of information. He taught them to distinguish the call of a hawk from that of an eagle, pointed out the tracks of a snowshoe hare near the woodshed, and explained why he banked the fire a certain way at night to conserve wood. These were lessons in survival, fragments of the knowledge he had accumulated in his solitude, and in sharing them, he was, piece by piece, sharing a part of himself. One evening, a week after their arrival, they were all gathered around the fire. The stew Elias had made, a tough, stringy affair of salted beef and potatoes, was shared from a single pot. The silence was more comfortable now, less a tense standoff and more a shared quiet. Beatrice, mending a tear in one of the blankets, looked over at Elias. "You have a fine place here, Mr. Vance," she said softly. "It's peaceful." Elias stared into the flames, a shadow passing over his face. "It wasn't always meant to be," he said, the words coming out low and strained. "It was, for a family." The admission hung in the air. None of them dared to ask more, but the unspoken truth of his loss settled among them, explaining the deep well of sadness in his eyes, the hollowed-out nature of his existence. It recontextualized everything: his isolation, his reluctance, his gruff exterior. He was not just a hermit, he was a man in mourning. Clara felt a profound ache of empathy for him. She understood what it was to have a dream of a future stolen away. Her own hopes for a new life had turned into a nightmare. She saw in him a reflection of her own resilience, a fellow survivor clinging to the wreckage of a life that was. The next morning, she found him by the small, fenced-off area behind the cabin. Two simple wooden crosses stood starkly against the snow. He was standing perfectly still, his hat in his hands despite the biting cold, his head bowed. He did not seem to notice her approach. She stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude on the sanctity of his grief. When he finally turned, his eyes were raw. He did not seem surprised to see her there. "My wife Hannah," he said, his voice hoarse, gesturing to the larger cross. "And our boy, Caleb. The fever took them, 3 years ago now." "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. He simply nodded, his gaze returning to the graves. "She would have liked you," he said after a long pause. "She had a fire in her too. Never backed down from a fight she believed in." He looked at Clara then, a flicker of something new in his expression, not pity, but a kind of recognition, a shared understanding of strength forged in hardship. "She would have taken you all in without a second thought. Wouldn't have been as grim-faced about it as me." It was the closest he had ever come to a confession of his own internal struggle. He was not just protecting them out of a reluctant sense of duty. He was honoring the memory of the woman he had lost. In that moment, standing by the graves of his past, the wall between Elias and Clara crumbled significantly. They were no longer just a man and a refugee, but two people bound by a common thread of loss and an unspoken will to endure. Later that day, the shift was palpable. Elias began taking his meals with them by the fire. He answered their questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about the land. He even let a small ghost of a smile touch his lips when Esther, proud of her handiwork, showed him a perfectly stitched leather patch. The cabin began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a shared fortress. They were no longer 5 desperate women and a solitary man. They were a unit, a strange and unlikely household, bound together by a shared threat and the slow, tentative growth of mutual respect and empathy. They were preparing for a war, but in the process, they were inadvertently building the foundations of a home. The fragile peace was broken on a cold, clear afternoon, 2 weeks after the women's arrival. Blue, who had become a shared companion and a reliable sentinel, suddenly shot up from his spot by the hearth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He ran to the door, his barking sharp and insistent. Elias was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the Winchester. The women froze, the color draining from their faces. The moment they had all been dreading was upon them. Elias peered cautiously through a small crack in the window shutter. On the ridge overlooking the valley, 3 riders were silhouetted against the pale winter sky. Even from this distance, he recognized the confident, predatory posture of the man in the lead. Garrett Blackwood had found them. "They're here," Elias said, his voice a low, grim statement of fact. 3 of them. Panic flared in Esther's eyes, and she let out a small, terrified whimper. Clara immediately went to her, her arm a steadying presence. "We knew this was coming, Esther," she said, her own voice tight but controlled. "We are ready." Martha moved to the door, her hand resting on the heavy bar she had helped reinforce. "The shutters are secure," she stated, her pragmatic nature taking over. Beatrice, meanwhile, herded Esther and a now frightened Abigail toward the back of the cabin, away from the door and window, creating a small, defensible space behind the large stone hearth. Elias watched them, a flicker of grim approval in his eyes. They were not screaming or collapsing. They were reacting, moving with purpose. He turned to Clara. "Stay away from the window. He'll try to talk first. Don't let him see you." The riders made their way down the slope, their horses picking their way carefully through the snow. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, a cautious distance. Elias could see Blackwood clearly now. He was a large man, dressed in a thick buffalo hide coat, his face florid and arrogant. The 2 men with him were lean and hard-faced, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "Hello, the cabin." Blackwood's voice boomed across the snow, filled clearing, a sound full of smug authority. "Vance, I know you're in there. I'm looking for some property that went missing from my establishment. 5 valuable pieces. I have reason to believe you're harboring them." Elias remained silent, his rifle held steady. He would not give Blackwood the satisfaction of an answer. "Don't be a fool, Vance," Blackwood shouted, a note of impatience creeping into his tone. "This has nothing to do with you. I have legal bills of sale for those girls. They belong to me. Send them out and we'll ride away. No trouble for you. You have my word." Inside the cabin, Martha let out a snort of derision, the word of a snake. Elias kept his eyes trained on the men. He knew Blackwood was testing him, trying to gauge his resolve. To harbor fugitives was one thing, to defy a man like Blackwood to his face was another. It was a line that, once crossed, could only end in blood. He thought of the 2 graves behind the cabin, of the quiet life he had tried to build on their ashes. And he thought of the 5 living, breathing women behind him, who had somehow, against his will, breathed life back into this empty shell of a home. "They are not property." The voice that rang out from the cabin was not his own, it was Clara's. She stood near the hearth, her back straight, her face blazing with a righteous fury that seemed to fill the small room. "We are free women, and we do not belong to you." Blackwood's face darkened with rage at being defied by one of the women. "Is that so? We'll see how free you are when I drag you back to Crimson Gulch by the hair." He turned his cold gaze back to the cabin. "Last chance, Vance. You're harboring thieves. I'm giving you till sundown to send them out. After that, my patience runs out. We'll burn you out if we have to." With that, he and his men wheeled their horses around and retreated back up the slope, disappearing over the ridge. They had not attacked, not yet. This was an ultimatum, a declaration of war. The stakes had been laid bare. Sundown. A heavy silence descended inside the cabin, thicker and more terrifying than any they had yet known. Esther was openly weeping now, her fear a palpable presence. Elias finally lowered the rifle and turned to face them. His expression was hard, his jaw set like granite. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze finally resting on Clara. "He'll be back," he said, "and he'll bring more men." "You should let us go," Martha said, her voice strained. "You could still tell him we forced you, that we left. You don't have to die for us." Elias walked over to the large wooden chest and opened it. He reached inside and pulled out an old, well-oiled Colt revolver and a smaller, but still serviceable, pistol. He walked over to Clara and pressed the heavy revolver into her hands. Then he went to Martha and gave her the other pistol. "I told you how to shoot," he said to Clara. "Martha, you look like you can handle that." He then looked at all of them, his voice low and steady, a bedrock of resolve in the turbulent sea of their fear. "This is my land," he said, the words coming from a place deep inside him, a place he thought had died with his family. "This is my home. No one is burning it, and no one is taking anyone from it." He was no longer just a grieving widower hiding from the world. He was a man defending his territory, his people. The women who had been a burden were now a cause. Their fight had become his own. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the 5 runaway brides and the solitary rancher prepared for the siege. The hours leading up to sundown were a blur of tense, focused preparation. The sky outside began to bruise into shades of purple and orange, a beautiful, haunting spectacle that promised a night of violence. Inside the cabin, Elias directed their efforts with the calm authority of a field commander. He was no longer a man adrift in grief. He was sharp, decisive, his every action geared toward survival. "Martha, Clara, you take the front window," he ordered. "Keep the shutters barred, but use the firing slots. Don't show yourselves unless you have a clear shot, and don't shoot unless I do." He handed them the precious few boxes of ammunition he had. "Make every bullet count." He turned to Beatrice. "You, Esther, and Abigail stay low behind the hearth. Keep the water buckets full. If they try to use fire, you'll be the ones to put it out. And keep this close." He gave her a heavy cast-iron skillet. "If any of them get inside, you swing for the head." His instructions were brutal and practical, leaving no room for sentiment. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the mountains, plunging the valley into a deep, cold twilight, an eerie silence fell. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the ragged breathing of 6 people waiting for a fight. Elias took his position at the side window, the one that gave him a view of the path leading down from the ridge. The Winchester felt like an extension of his arm. They did not have to wait long. 6 riders appeared on the ridge this time, dark figures against the last glow of the sky. Blackwood had brought reinforcements. They moved down the slope, spreading out to encircle the cabin. They were not charging. This was a methodical, confident approach. They clearly expected an easy victory against one man. "Vance, time's up." Blackwood's voice cut through the twilight. "Send them out now, or we're coming in." Elias raised the Winchester to his shoulder, his eyes sighting down the long barrel. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the stillness. It wasn't aimed at a man. The bullet struck the ground a few feet in front of Blackwood's horse, kicking up a spray of snow and dirt. It was a warning, the only one they would get. The response was immediate. A volley of gunfire erupted from the riders, bullets thudding into the thick logs of the cabin walls. One found a gap in the shutters, splintering the window frame and sending glass shards flying. Esther screamed, burying her face in Beatrice's side. "Hold your fire," Elias yelled to the women. "They're trying to make us waste ammunition." The siege began in earnest. 2 of Blackwood's men dismounted and crept toward the cabin under the cover of the growing darkness, while the others kept up a sporadic fire. Elias tracked their movements, waiting. He saw one of the men reach the woodshed, preparing to use it as cover for a final rush to the door. Elias fired again. A cry of pain cut through the night, and the man staggered back, clutching his shoulder, before being dragged away by his companion. A new threat emerged. One of the men on horseback circled to the back of the cabin, out of Elias's line of sight. He was carrying a torch, its flames a flickering, malevolent orange in the darkness. "He's trying to fire the barn," Elias shouted. Before he could decide what to do, the report of a pistol shot echoed from the front of the cabin. It was a sharper, higher sound than his rifle. From her position, Martha had seen the man with the torch. She had rested the pistol on the sill of the firing slot, taken careful aim, and fired. The man yelled in surprise as the torch flew from his hand, sputtering out in the snow. He quickly retreated. A grim smile touched Elias's lips. They were fighting back. They were not helpless. Enraged, Blackwood changed tactics. "Forget taking them alive. Burn the whole damn place to the ground," he roared. The remaining men dismounted, using their horses as shields as they advanced, all of them now carrying lit torches. This was the moment Elias had feared. He could not shoot all of them at once. They began to rush the cabin from 3 sides. "Clara now!" Elias yelled. Clara took a deep breath, aimed her heavy revolver at the closest charging figure, and fired. The kick of the gun jarred her arm, but the man stumbled and fell. At the same moment, Elias took down another, but there were still 2 more, almost at the walls, their torches held high. One of them hurled his torch onto the roof. Dry shingles, parched by the winter air, began to smoke and then smolder. "Fire on the roof!" Beatrice cried out. She and Esther grabbed the water buckets, but they had no way to reach the flames. Panic began to set in. Suddenly, the front door rattled violently as one of Blackwood's men threw his shoulder against it. The reinforced bar held, but the wood groaned under the assault. Martha stood her ground, her pistol aimed at the door, her face a mask of grim determination. The confrontation had reached its peak. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and the cabin was about to catch fire. It seemed a hopeless fight, but Elias had one last, desperate card to play. Earlier, while preparing, he had noticed the way the wind was picking up again, funneling down through the narrow valley from the north. He had tied a long rope to the heavy iron kettle that Beatrice had filled with animal fat and grease for making soap. "Beatrice, help me with the kettle," he shouted. As she rushed to his side, he smashed the remaining glass from the side window. "When I swing it out, cut the rope." Hefting the incredibly heavy, sloshing kettle, he swung it back and forth like a pendulum, gathering momentum. With a final, desperate heave, he swung it out the window. As it reached the apex of its arc, Beatrice, understanding his intent, slashed the rope with a knife. The kettle flew through the air, tumbling end over end, and crashed onto the ground right in the middle of Blackwood and his remaining man. The hot grease exploded outwards, spattering their clothes and the dry ground around them. At that exact moment, Elias fired his rifle again, not at the men, but at the lantern still hanging from Blackwood's saddle. The bullet shattered the glass, and the burning oil ignited the grease-soaked ground. A wall of flame erupted with a terrifying whoosh, cutting off the attackers from the cabin and trapping them in a circle of fire. Their horses screamed in terror and bolted. Blackwood and his man, their clothes now smoldering, scrambled away from the flames, their attack utterly broken. They fled into the darkness, a disorganized and defeated rabble, leaving their injured behind. The fire on the ground burned itself out quickly in the snow, but the smoldering on the roof was now a small, growing flame. Elias, Clara, and Martha rushed outside, using blankets and shovelfuls of snow to beat out the fire. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized by adrenaline and a shared will to save their sanctuary. Finally, the last ember was extinguished. They stood in the aftermath, panting in the freezing air, the smell of gunpowder and smoke thick around them. The silence that returned was different now. It was not empty. It was the quiet of victory, of survival. Elias looked at the women, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide but shining with a fierce, triumphant light. They had faced down the monster from Crimson Gulch, and they had won. In the heart of that dark, violent night, they had defended their home together. In the quiet, cold light of the following dawn, the valley looked peaceful, belying the violence of the night. The snow was trampled and scorched in patches, and one of Blackwood's men, the one Elias had shot in the shoulder, sat slumped against the woodshed, having been abandoned by his employer. He was shivering, more from fear than cold, and surrendered without a fight. The other man Clara had shot had been carried off, leaving a grim trail of blood in the snow. The atmosphere inside the cabin was one of weary relief. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a deep, unshakable bond forged in the crucible of the siege. They moved around each other with a new ease, the last vestiges of suspicion and distance burned away by the shared fight for their lives. Beatrice tended to a burn on Martha's arm, while Esther, her fear replaced by a quiet awe, helped Clara clean and reload the pistols. Elias dealt with the prisoner, tying his hands and leaving him in the lean-to with a blanket and some water. He would take him to the marshal in the next town over as soon as it was safe to travel. Garrett Blackwood would not be returning. A man like him, defeated so soundly and publicly, would lose the respect born of fear that his power depended on. His small empire in Crimson Gulch was likely already crumbling. Later that morning, Elias stood by the window, watching the sun rise higher, its light glinting off the pristine snow on the mountain peaks. Clara came to stand beside him, a tin cup of coffee in her hands. She offered it to him. He took it, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. "It's over," she said, her voice soft. "For now," he answered, but there was no grimness in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact. The world was still a dangerous place, but they had proven they could face it. He took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and strong, chasing away the last of the night's chill. "What will you do now?" he asked, looking at her. "You're free to go wherever you want. Once I take him to the marshal and tell him what happened, no one will bother you." Clara looked around the small, battered cabin. She saw Martha instructing Esther on how to properly bank a fire. She saw Beatrice humming softly as she kneaded a small lump of dough for biscuits. She saw Abigail, pale but smiling, sitting up and wrapped in a warm blanket. The room was filled with the small, comforting sounds of life. It was messy, crowded, and scarred, but it felt more like a home than any place she had ever known. "I don't think we have anywhere else to go," she said, her gaze returning to his, "and I'm not sure we want to." She paused, her expression earnest and hopeful. "We were wondering if you'd have us. We can work, we can earn our keep. Martha is good with tools, Beatrice knows herbs and gardening, Esther can sew anything, and Abigail is stronger than she looks. We can help you run this place. Make it what it was meant to be." Elias looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength that had never wavered, the compassion that had cared for her friends, the fire that had defied a tyrant. He looked around his cabin and saw not an intrusion, but a completion. The silence he had once clung to now seemed like a sickness. The echoes of his past were no longer the only voices in the room. They were joined by new ones, full of life and resilience and hope. He thought of the two crosses behind the cabin. For 3 years, he had been living in the past, a guardian of ghosts. These women were the future. They had not replaced his family, but they had given him a reason to live for something more than just a memory. They had given him a new family, one forged in snow and fear and fire. A slow smile spread across his face, a real smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his grief. It felt foreign and wonderful. "The roof needs mending," he said, his voice softer than they had ever heard it. "And there are spring plantings to plan. It's a lot of work for one man." It was not a formal acceptance, but it was everything. It was a promise of a shared future, an acknowledgement of a new beginning. As the morning sun streamed into the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the solitary cowboy was no longer alone. He was surrounded by 5 extraordinary women who had run from a nightmare and found sanctuary not just in a place, but in a person. And together, In that small cabin nestled deep in the Wyoming wilderness, this unlikely family began the slow, quiet work of building a life.